Morning. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. My notes. Just to outline, I'm going to go over sort of a couple parts. Part one is going to be why space exploration, probably a little broader than some of the other guys have talked about. And the second part will be a little bit on thoughts going forward on partly the landscape. I'm not sure I've got any magic prescriptions as to how to get through all this, but some ideas on some of the boundary conditions. So, why we have a space exploration and civilian space program? I mean, there are a lot of different answers to that. There are multiple levels. I mean, the natural, sort of literal one is Sputnik. Sputnik happened, and we went into crisis mode, and NASA was created as a reaction in the science program. And if you go back and look at the NASA Act of 1958 and what it was tasked to do, and so there's sort of the literal levels. I mean, part of that is, it stands on several legs. There's no real one or two justifications for the civilian space program or space exploration. It really stands as on multiple legs. It's kind of a Venn diagram where there are many overlapping missions and purposes that sort of fit together. It changes in emphasis over time, but just to highlight a couple of those because I think it's instructive. I think the first, or one of the first things stated in the Declaration of Policy is scientific knowledge, expanding human knowledge and understanding. And I think if you look back, or I'm not quite old enough to remember the late 50s, but I do remember the 60s. But if you think back to those times and what we knew or didn't really know about space, and we didn't know about water on the moon and water on Mars or potential life out there. Or the only volcanoes we knew of were on Earth, and now we have a moon of Jupiter. It's got huge volcanoes. There's a sea of water under Europa. There's a lot that NASA has done over the last 50 plus years in the scientific realm. And when the discussion space exploration policy, I don't look at that simply as a human thing. I think it's a much broader quilt that science really leads the way, and humans are part of that, and NASA's program ultimately needs to be balanced. So scientific knowledge is a key, fundamental, rock-bed tenet of why we have NASA and space exploration. Technological innovation. In many ways, NASA's a dual-use program. When in post-Sputnik, we're worried that the Russians were outdoing us in the space program, and so we needed to get going. We need to put some emphasis on developing similar technologies or better technologies, and I think that's a main part of what NASA's about. And that leads to the industrial base and having a strong industrial base. I think the luxury of going last is I can slightly comment on the other guys, but I'll try to be fairly brief to leave room for questions, time for questions, is I think commercial plays a role, but I think the government plays a role. I think the government needs to be a smart buyer. I think the government needs to have laboratories and centers that are deeply involved in hardware and development. I think it needs to be a balance. And over time, the balance has swung in both directions too far. Interestingly, in the 80s, thinking of commercial, in the NASA Act was added, they were successful in amending the Act in a way to promote commercial space pretty much right up front. And sometimes there's sort of an implied priority. But promoting commercial space is an important part of what NASA does, and that goes back to early communication satellites, and now more recently with commercial cargo and crew. NASA is also a tool of international diplomacy. I think, and some of the folks that are more familiar with this than I am probably know, but I believe NASA has more international agreements and things like that than most any other agency. Maybe it's State Department, maybe an exception, but they have a tremendous amount of international cooperation. It is a tool for diplomacy. In times when we can't get along, say, with the Soviet Union, or things are rough, we had Apollo-Soyuz. It kept the lines of communication open. So looking at NASA and civilian space and space exploration in a broader picture, it serves a much broader role. In 2005, the NASA Act was amended to include NEOs, search and tracking of NEOs. And some at NASA said that's a bean counting job, that's not really science, that's not ours, but I think it's an important one that Congress has asked them to do. Jim and Charles have talked about extending human presence beyond Earth orbit, colonization. that ultimately is probably where we're headed. From a strict, at this level, strict constructionist point of view, it's hard to find exactly where in the Space Act human space flight is really identified. It's sort of obliquely referred to. It's not a core purpose as stated in the Act, although it has been a dominant part of the agency for the last 45 years or so. So those are sort of, at that level, the kind of literal rationale for why we have NASA. And I'd like everybody to take a bigger step back and see what it really means. And I think space exploration and NASA are really a potent symbol of American leadership, idealism, technological prowess. And point to a couple examples, sort of obvious ones. Putting Neil Armstrong on the moon. You know, Russia was leading us in the space program with Yuri Gagarin and Kennedy with very little experience, not him literally, but NASA with very little experience putting people in space. Said, we're going to put someone on the moon and come back. It was in a geopolitical context. It was an important symbolic act to put Neil Armstrong and the other astronauts eventually on the moon and bring them back to show that we had the technological prowess. Don't mess with us. We can do whatever we want technologically. Apollo 8, I think it was Frank Borman who read the Bible verse coming around the moon, looked at the Earth, and it is the full disk view of the Earth just floating there in space. And that has an amazing cultural impact on society. Neil deGrasse Tyson's given moving talks about how, you know, you see the full disk Earth and there are no boundaries, no political, it's not like a map you see in a high school. You look at and see how fragile and beautiful it is. And that really gave birth, or maybe birth is too strong, but really put momentum behind the environmental movement. And is really a huge cultural icon of the time. Same thing with the Hubble pictures. People are amazed at that. And the science that's come from that in terms of learning the age of the universe. I mean, it wasn't a few years ago we thought the universe was expanding, but slowing down, now it's accelerating. We find that the vast majority of what the universe is made of, we don't even understand. It's dark energy and dark matter. I mean, 50 years ago we didn't know any of this. This is important stuff, I think, culturally, and for the country, and it's important for America to lead it. You look more recently at the Mars science landing and the excitement in the control room when we landed on, or when JPL and the team landed on Mars. That captivated people. And I've been told that when the Mars Phoenix landed a few years ago, that in newspapers around the world it was headline news. In places like Pakistan that don't, you know, they usually don't speak well of America and have issues, but they say, God, look at this. Look at they did, and it's kind of for humanity, and we want to be out in front. We are a frontier nation and pioneers. Now, I think NASA's successes are a barometer of our national competence and confidence. That when you see us land on Mars, you say, that's us. You know, NASA's kind of the smartest guy in the class. You know, if NASA can do this, and I think that's really, really fundamentally important if you're going to maintain and sustain space exploration, whether it's robotically or with humans over a period of time. So I think in general, sometimes we're so close that we underestimate the deep cultural impact that space exploration has on humanity. So I've got my historical analogy, and it's one that I think bears directly on this. And if you back up, I'm not going to back up a couple hundred years, I'm going to back up 500 plus years. And back at that time, they'd look up at the sky and the explanations for why the stars were there, phases of the moon, was myth and magic and mysticism until in the 1500s when Nicholas Copernicus said, you know, I'm not so sure that the Earth is really the center of the universe and everything, that everything revolves around us. And it was his theory, and I suspect he was probably chastised and lost his grant. But later on, he had Galileo and others that substantiated it. It's clearly the retrograde motion of Mars and things like that were not due to some machination of mysticism, but was really explained by putting the sun at the center of the solar system, and that the universe really looked the same from all different angles. We weren't the center of the universe. It was a revolutionary theory at that time, and that's when the spark that ignited the Age of Enlightenment, science and technology and reason, that it gave revolution to things like physics and math and engineering and medicine, and ultimately led, and Charles brought this up, to freedom, individual freedom, freedom to think, not whatever the mystics and the myths and the gods and so forth thought, but individual freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. A lot of what we are about as Americans really go back to that kernel in time. And it wasn't just Copernicus, but that's sort of generally pointed to as the spark. And I've got my quote that I pulled out by a German, Johann Gert. I'm not very good at my German, I think that's correct. But he wrote this quote a couple years after Copernicus and said, "Of all discoveries and opinions, none may have exerted a greater effect on the human spirit than the doctrine of Copernicus. The world has scarcely become known as round and complete in itself when it was asked to waive the tremendous privilege of being the center of the universe." And I think that's huge. I mean, it was a seminal moment in human history that really has sort of echoed over the centuries and continues. And I think we're starting to look at, where are we on the frontiers of space technology and space exploration? And you look at Mars and Europa and dark energy and the universe and all these mysteries, and I think it's pushing that scientific and knowledge frontier. We also have to push the physical and human frontier too. So I think we are at the dawn of another revolution, and I think it's really what great nations do, and that's why we got to continue space exploration. I think that's really the big picture on the rationale for why. So let me turn to what do we do. Let's sort of zoom back into November 1st, 2012. Sorry, still thinking of the 13 budget. 2012 and what it looks like forward. We're in an age of austerity. We're in an age where fixed, as they said last year, up or flat is the new up. The age of austerity, budgets are going to be constrained. I am very concerned about calls for bold missions. I think, the Columbia accident's almost 10 years ago, and that was a seminal event for NASA in terms of looking, okay, we're going to finish station, keep that, but what are we going to go forward? And we've had sort of collectively a couple, 3, 4 times at the bat on trying to get this with a bold vision and a commitment. And there have been periods of consensus, but it hasn't been lasting. I worry that a bold vision that says we got to do something like Apollo is akin to swinging for the fences, where, yeah, you might get a home run, but it's more likely you're going to strike out, particularly in this environment, and that what we really need are some singles, doubles, and triples to get some runs on the board and to move the ball forward. It may not be as fast as we'd like or as far as we'd like, but I think that's absolutely critical that we maintain it. That I think the greatest threat to human space exploration is to continue to have unrealistic expectations and end up going nowhere. That the misalignment between budgetary resources and our appetite for what we want to do. I think that ultimately implies that we need to break it up into smaller steps, maybe more incremental. It does, I agree with the other guys about keeping the tempo up, keeping, I think having a program that goes 10 or 15 or 20 years for then the big launch is an unsustainable strategy and a very risky one, not likely to succeed. So I think breaking up into smaller steps, and people point to Apollo and it was certainly a true success by almost every measure, and it's often pointed to about they had geopolitical big support and a blank budget or blank check, so forth. Not quite accurate, but it was certainly different. But I think a more subtle difference is it was constrained in time. They said, let's get this done by the end of the decade, or that's what Kennedy did. And I think there's a high correlation between programs that run into trouble and long schedules. And I think we need to work to put together, I think it's got to be mission-driven and vision-driven. And I think the vision is there. I mean, the choices are, you have station, you have the moon, you have asteroids, you have Mars, and it's sort of laid out for you. The question is how fast and in what steps. And I think that's really what's lacking, is people look at the current program and they say, Yeah, I hear you say, we're going to go this way, Lagrange point maybe is another one, but an asteroid or somewhere like that. But it's not clear how you do that. What are those incremental steps? I think the Orion test flight is a good incremental step. What are the next 5 and 6 and 8 and 10 steps to get there? And I think that's really important. Just for scale, two questions on the human side. Apollo, if we could do it as well as we've done it before, or did it before, is $160 billion in current dollars. And ESMD, we spend $3 to $4 billion a year. So that's assuming all else is equal, and flat funding, which is, these are sort of very rough order, it's 40 years just to do Apollo. And I'm not sure we can do it as well as we did. I think we didn't. Back then, we didn't know what we didn't know. Now we know a lot more, and the bureaucracy has grown up, and it's a lot harder, and so forth. So, I think the 160 billion is fairly generous. So I think we need to have sort of an incremental. I think a big decision that's coming down about a couple, 3 years down the road is, do you keep the station? How long can you? The station right now is about $3 billion a year, and in policy, it's supposed to go to 2020. After that, NASA, as long the general rule, I think, as we all know, in space is if it's working and it's doing well, you don't turn it off. But $3 billion tab every year is pretty steep, and that inhibits a significant amount of ability to do anything beyond Earth orbit on the side, human side. So I think there's a question, as the 16 budget comes out, and we'll have the numbers for FY20, 5-year budget run out, is to start thinking about that process. Do we keep space station because it's still working, and that has a direct impact on our ability to do beyond Earth orbit space, human space? Do we look at some plan to ramp down? Do we figure out a way to reduce the cost sharing? I think it's a big question. Probably isn't going to become ripe for a couple more years, but I think it's an important one, because I think NASA's budget will be flat. Things may actually get sort of a reset after sequestration, be flat from there. I think science is a huge part of keeping the public sold on it. Some of those inspirational things that show our technical prowess, I think that's an important part. And it's really a crying shame when you have a decadal survey, a discovery mission that's going to go from every 2 years to 5. In just the last recent source selection, they picked InSight, a Mars mission, a geological, whatever, Marsological program. They left Time and Chopper. Time was to put a boat, a little floating thing, on Titan, on a methane lake on Titan, for $500 million-ish. Chopper was going to go to comets. And I think those are hugely important, and we really need to look at that balance. And frankly, if this is I were king, I'd probably add 5% of NASA's overall budget to rebalance to science to keep that tempo going. I think it's important for the industrial base. I think it's important for the scientific base. So in summary, obviously, these are very challenging times. I think there is a path through this. It may not make it's not going to be, everybody's going to agree on a vision and fund it. I think the idea that the budget will follow the policy is probably not operative. I think budget will constrain policy and drive it. So appreciate your time and attention, and look forward to your questions.